I think the Creative University is in strife. I think that its power, its productivity, its interest value, its excitement and so forth have been declining visibly in the last 40 years. It's in strife. So what shall we leave behind? Bureaucracy? Get rid of it. It's killing us. What shall we maintain? Well, we should maintain the core mission of not just the Creative University, but any creative process, which is to discover, to invent and to create, all of which are quite difficult things, but they're interesting, they're highly socially productive, we need to do them, and we are currently, in reality, when we look at the hard numbers now, we really are under the surface struggling to be nearly as good as we could be. We cannot know the future because we can change the future. But what I can say is that post-2008 onwards, if we continue as we have for the past 40 years, we will end in dire straits. It's a happy opening. Global creativity is in decline. It is probably in our power to correct that decline, but that will not be an easy matter, as the following metrics suggest. The simplest measure of human creativity is economic productivity. Productivity is simply institutionalised ingenuity. The rate of productivity increase or decrease can be thought of as an expression of the success or failure of innovation and its applications. It is innovation manifest at a very practical, concrete, social level. Productivity is a measure of the human capacity to do more with less. It is innovation underpinned by fundamental human creation that allows us to do exactly this. In the postmodern era, employment in research and development per capita in OECD countries grew remarkably. Let's see if we can get a slide up here. It tripled in West Germany and France and quadrupled in Japan between 1965 and 1989. From 1994 to 2008, gross domestic expenditure on R&D as a percentage of gross domestic product rose from 2.1% to 2.3% across the OECD, from 2.4% to 2.75% in the United States, and from 2.6% to 3.4% in Japan. Yet globally, amongst the wealthy countries, productivity has been trending down since the 1970s. Australia is a typical example. In the 1960s, its annual average rate of growth of labour productivity was 3.1%. After 1970, this falls sharply. In the 1970s, the rate was 1.8. In the 1980s, it was 1.1. It's improved a bit in the 1990s, maybe in the second half of that decade, averaging 2.3%. Then it fell away again to 1.7% in the 2000s. Thus, while after 1970 investment in higher education and in research increased dramatically, economic productivity declined. Not only that, but also the research yield per real research dollar declined as well. Again, in respect of the latter, the Australian figures are revealing and they are typical. In 1993, Australian academics produced 1.5 publications per head per annum. This metric tumbled as low as 0.6 in 1997, and it has been an anemic 1.0 per capita per annum since 2004. During the period, Australia increased its real external funding of research. Total university research income in 2011 dollar terms rose from $744 million in 1992 to $3,172 million in 2010. Yet the number of research publications per 100,000 income fell from 3.6 in 1992 to 1.5 in 2010. So, what happened? And let me tell you, those figures, although they're Australian figures, are typical globally across the OECD. So there's nothing special about that. It's just the example that proves the general case. My question then is, what happened? Well, in simplest terms, I'm going to propose to you that the Knowledge Society was a fake. It produced less, not more, innovation and creation. And knowledge was a euphemism for bureaucracy. What the Knowledge Society generated were larger bureaucracies and ever more regulation. And the universities, above all, were typical of this. The post-1970 university developed as a mass bureaucratic university. Typical of what then happened, the ratio of administrative to academic staff in universities rose from 0.2 to 1 in the 1960s to 0.4 to 1 in the 1980s. In Australia, the ratio inflated rapidly in the late 1980s and early 1990s as a unified national system, put that in inverted commas, of bureaucratic centralism and aggressive legal rational proceduralism was instituted across the university sector. By 1996, the ratio of administrative to academic staff in Australia had reached 1.3 to 1, where it has remained ever since. This story is a familiar one across much or most of the OECD. Everyone experiences local variants of it, but the grand narrative is the same. So as the consequence, legal rationalism asphyxiates the act of creation. It kills creativity, in simple terms. It denies it oxygen. It diverts attention to policy, process and procedure instead of the production of output. Objectivation lies at the heart of innovation and creation. Under bureaucratic conditions, objectivation is subsumed by norm and regulation. Research is overdetermined by research management bureaucracies that value procedure in place of productivity. This is both a symptom of and a metaphor for the larger decline of social and economic productivity. In short, today, the more that we research, the less productive we are. This is the very opposite of knowledge society hyperbole. It is also a reversal of a historical trend that had the most far-reaching consequences for human well-being. This is where the story starts to get serious. In a series of industrial revolutions, from approximately 1770 to 1970, the ingenious application of the arts and sciences utterly transformed human standards of living. The economist Deirdre McCloskey puts it this way. 2 centuries ago, the world's economy stood at the present level of Bangladesh. Just consider that for a moment. In 1800, in our dollar terms, that is in contemporary dollar terms, the average human being lived on $3 a day. A person today in France or Japan lives on $100 a day. In Norway, the average person earns 45 times more than their predecessor did in 1800. A remarkable $145 a day. Well done, Norway. Chinese today have got to an average of $13 a day, 4 times the 1800 level, and that, of course, is rising. Today, only 1.1 billion of the world's 6.7 billion people still lives on $3 a day. If anything is progress, then that is progress. So what made it possible? It was not any of the usual suspects. It was not education, nor was it trade. Bukowski says it was innovation. I agree. It was the institutionalisation of inventions, from automobiles to electronics, constitutional states to antibiotics, that made the difference. Today, however, we are less inventive than we were 200 years ago. We are less fundamentally imaginative in the arts and the sciences, including the social sciences, than we were in the 19th century. We have also fallen significantly far behind the distinctive short burst of technological creativity in the mid-20th century. We see the symptoms of this in declining real economic performance. The chain of creation, innovation and productivity is the driver of real growth, of GDP growth and real income growth. When the former declines, so with lags does the latter. In addition, real GDP and real income growth drive relative income equality. This is because higher real wages are the most effective vehicle of income proportionality. Not only that, it is innovation-generated growth alone that can lift the poorest up out of misery of living on $3 a day. The data collated by Northwestern University economist Robert Gordon indicates that growth in real GDP per capita from 1300 to 1700 was 0.2% per annum. Not very much. Between the first industrial revolution and the beginning of the 20th century, Britain increased that to just over 1% per annum, which was basically the China of its day. In the 1940s and 1950s, the United States achieved a remarkable 2.5% growth in real GDP per capita. After that heroic peak, US growth begins to ratchet downwards. It does this in a series of steep step-like movements in 1964, 1972, 1987 and 2008 to today's level of around 1.3% growth in real GDP per capita. This long historical development is reflected in average real per capita income. Hang on, actually, my slide is doing it for me. A very intelligent slide. Okay, this long historical development is reflected in average real per capita income. In the UK in the 1300s, average real income was $1,150 per person in 2010 prices. By 1800, average income was $3,450 per annum. It almost doubled a century later, reaching $6,350 in 1906. In the United States, in the 28 years between 1929 and 1959, real income doubled again, rising from $8,000 in 1929 to $16,000 in 1959. But then the pace starts to slow. US per capita income doubles again, but this time in the 31 years to 1998. Then the pace slows once more. George Mason University economist Tyler Cohen suggests that a key moment is the early 1970s. He points out that a 1947 US median family income calculated in 2004 real dollar terms was $21,771. By 1973, that is 26 years later, it had more than doubled to $44,381. In the following 31 years, from 1973 to 2004, median family income rose only to $54,061, which was less than a 22% increase. Cohen points out that with a growth rate of 2% a year, real income doubles in size about every 31 years. At a 3% rate of growth, living standards double about every 23 years. At today's 1+% growth rate, things are not looking so good. And again, while I'm using national examples, the picture that I'm setting out for you is really symptomatic across the board. So, what went wrong? In the simplest terms, the engine of creation innovation is spluttering. Stanford University economist Charles I. Jones suggests, correctly, that most contemporary innovations deliver only a marginal benefit for most people. The converse of this is that fewer and fewer fundamental discoveries are being made. 80% of economic growth during the period 1950 to 1993, Jones estimates, came from the application of previously discovered ideas. He suggests that this latent value was mobilised through investments in education and education-driven research. Jones, like Robert Gordon and more sceptically Tyler Cohen, thinks education is a plus in this matrix. I have a contrary view. In fact, the decline in income growth, productivity and creative impetus after 1970 closely tracks the rise of mass higher education. While we like to think of education as inventive, in fact it is principally transmissive. While a handful of universities, or more particularly university enclaves, are discovery driven, most of the bureaucratic mass universities are not, certainly not in practice. Consequently, since 1970, OECD countries have spent a large amount of money achieving a minimal amount of advancement in the arts and sciences. The same is true of industry. Consider journalist Michael Mandel's observation in 2009 about the multitude of promises made 10 years prior about the coming biomedical and other revolutions. The world was assured of breakthrough cancer treatments, gene therapies, stem cell therapies, tissue engineering, high-speed satellite internet, cars powered by fuel cells, micro machines on chips and so on. What happened to such products, Mandel asks. A decade on, he noted that no gene therapy had been approved for sale in the United States. Rural dwellers could get satellite internet, but the service was far slower than what had been promised. That's a familiar story. The terrible economics of alternative energy had not changed much in a decade. And while the biotechnology industry had produced some important drugs, such as the cancer drugs Avastin and Gleevec, Mandel reflected that gains in health technology had been disappointing compared with the sums invested in research. The latter indicates a subtle but lacerating problem. It is not that today there are no breakthroughs, rather the escalating real cost of breakthrough is a sign of declining real inventive impetus. Mandel observed that 2008 was the first year that the US biotech industry collectively had made a profit. It is not surprising then that the stock index that tracks the pharmaceutical, biotech and life sciences companies in the Standard & Poor's 500 stock index dropped 32% from the end of 1998 to the end of 2007 after adjusting for inflation. The information technology industry was long past its prime, yet its index by comparison fell only 29% over the period. If you still think that there is no problem here, then consider that it is not just technological creativity that is measurably declining. So is the general level of social creativity. The standard test of human creativity is the Torrance Tests of Creative Thinking, TTCT. The battery was designed by University of Georgia Professor Ellis Paul Torrance in 1996, and multiple versions of it have been devised since then. Its actual origins goes back to Torrance's time at the University of Minnesota in the late 1950s. The test, when administered to children, is 3 times more likely to predict adult creativity than IQ tests do. However, in 2010, a professor at the College of William and Mary, Kaeun-hee Kim, published a reanalysis of nearly 300,000 Torrance scores from 5 decades worth of tests on children and adults administered by the US-based Scholastic Testing Service. Results of Kim's study were chastening. Her research revealed that creativity scores, which previously had risen steadily, had stopped rising in 1990 and had experienced a statistically significant decline after that turning point. 20 years into the postmodern era, creativity scores were generally falling off, and some of the subsidiary components of creativity tested for by the Torrance test had begun to decline as early as 1984. The fall-off was worst among the very young, those aged from kindergarten to 3rd grade. What does this mean? It means that the decline in creation and innovation had begun to extend deeply into the pores of the wider society. Kim found that the decline in creative thinking was steady and persistent from 1990 to 2008 and ranged across the various components tested by the TTCT. At the same time, IQ tests had been trending in the opposite direction, upwards. What this hints at is that a typical postmodern clever country or smart society, like the United States or Australia, might manage to be measurably more intelligent and yet at the same time end up being disarmingly less creative. This is a paradox worth reflecting upon. It suggests that the habitual identification of education, or even general social problem solving, with creation is misleading. At the very least, it suggests that it is time to retire the cool, clever, smart metaphors of the 1990s and the glib fetishes of knowledge society elites, epitomised in government circles by America's Obama administration. The decline in the Torrance test scores is echoed at the highest levels of social creation. That's where I want to get to. Good. Works that have the longest lasting social effects and that have the greatest social, existential and utilitarian significance are at stake here. High-level creation is difficult to objectively measure in any contemporary moment as opposed to the distant past. We simply have difficulty distinguishing between greatness and glibness in our own time. Special pleading ingratiates creative work that is specious. Power, influence, office and status magnify the importance of works that make no lasting contribution to the arts or the sciences. To make a judgment of greatness or not in our own era, we have to step aside from the rhetoric of the booster and look at some hard numbers. Here's a set of hard numbers. One of the most influential fields in the humanities and social sciences in the 20th century was that of cultural theory. It incorporated works of most of the prominent thinkers of the 20th century. Practically all the great philosophers, sociologists, literary critics and theory-driven historians, economists and anthropologists of the 20th century contributed to the field. Yet, like so many fields across the spectrum of human knowledge, the energy and productivity of cultural theory visibly waned in the later decades of the century. The loss of energy and output and the corresponding decline per capita in the number of high-level outputs in the field is measurable and clear. And here's an analysis that I did on Ellis Cashmore and Chris Rojek's 1999 Dictionary of Cultural Theorists, and it works out the rise and then the decline after the 1970s of cultural theory across time. This is measured across works in cultural theory produced principally in the United States, the United Kingdom, France and Germany, and this is a measure of their per capita production over the course of the 20th century. So what you see is basically, I think, what we see more generally across the 20th century in creation generally is that it moves up, and then after the 1970s it moves down. Now the same problem that you see here applied to the heights of cultural theory, the same problem applies to the creative arts. In the visual arts, the period between 1890 and 1970, that is between Cézanne and Rothko, was outstanding. What followed was dismal. Almost any postmodern work, that is, works produced between 1970 and 2000, was forgettable, bar a handful. Contemporary post-2000 digital media artworks are occasionally interesting, yet, as their name suggests, they lack the kind of strong conceptual identity that marked the modernist era in art. The same creative deficit applies to popular marketed artworks as much as elite gallery artworks. Rolling Stone magazine's 2012 music industry poll of the top 500 music albums lists 11 works from the 1950s, 105 from the 1960s, 187 from the 1970s, 82 from the 1980s, 75 from the 1990s, 38 from the 2000s, and 2 from the truncated 2010s, which I believe we're still in. This collective judgment and the art of creation it reveals is an accurate one. More interesting still are the figures from the 1970s, if we go back to them. Technically, the creative output of the 1970s exceeds that of the 1960s, as you can see from up here, excepting that when one drills down into the figures, what is revealed is that 50% of the best 1970s albums came from the first 4 years of their decade, that is 1970, 71, 72 and 73, and immediately after that point there is a sharp drop-off in first-class output. The distinct downward shift after 1973 pinpoints the general problem in creation in the last 40 years. Now, the arc of creativity, though, is a longer one than simply 40 years. A list of the 50 greatest British inventions was compiled by BBC science experts in a 2013 Radio Times poll. Notably, the decade of the 1820s accounted for a tenth, just consider this, 1/10 of the poll-nominated biggest breakthroughs in 350 years of British innovation. It was a good decade, the 1820s. The decade included Charles Mackintosh's waterproof material, Michael Faraday's electric motor, who would we be without that, Joseph Aspdin's cement, again, George Stephenson's passenger railway, and Edward Beard Budding's lawnmower. And I'll have more to say on the lawnmower in a moment by way of conclusion. The physicist Jonathan Huebner calculated that the peak of global technological innovation... Anyway, I can get ahead of myself. The physicist Joseph Huebner calculated that the peak of global technological innovation occurred in 1870. My calculation is that the peak of US patent registration per capita occurred in 1914, and the peak of US copyright registration per capita occurred in the 1890s. Data of this kind points to a long-run timeline of ebbing cultural creative energy. Within the long-run line of decline that begins around 1870, there is a more recent decline line that begins around 1970. What this points to is that the arts and the sciences the last 40 years have been in aggregate distinctly inferior in quantity and quality to those of both the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. At the very moment when our own multiple decades-long creative recession began back in the 1970s, the philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis observed in situ that the social impetus to discovery had begun to wane radically. He was almost alone in observing this at the time. The postmodern decades were filled with creative boosters, often of a very pretentious kind. Today, Castoriadis' lonely observation is eloquently confirmed by Dean Keith Simonton. Simonton, who is Professor of Psychology at the University of California at Davis, has spent 4 decades writing about creativity. This year, in January 2013, in the journal Nature, he bluntly stated that the kind of scientific originality that characterised the eras of Michelson and Morley or Einstein had abated. Imaginative leaps today have become much rarer. Domain-specific expertise now dominates science. And while scientific knowledge advances, it does so without altering the foundations of knowledge. Why, then, is this so? Well, by conclusion, let me make a couple of final comments by way of conclusion. 2 sets of observations. First, in 1984, Simonton noted that creation works by amalgamating hitherto unrelated insights, as Einstein did when he merged Maxwell's electromagnetic theory with Newtonian mechanics. Simonton put it beautifully when he said that innovation depends on the ability to see relationships between hitherto unconnected ideas or methods and then to fuse them into a new synthesis. Nous, that is creation. And in large part, I would contend we have lost, or we're in the process of losing the capacity to do this on a large-scale collective social level. Which then begs the question, why is this so? Well, the answer at the end of this paper is exactly the same as the answer at the beginning of this paper. Our problem is the problem of an excess of bureaucratic legal rationality.
That's true.
There you are. You see, truth. Truth still persists in the university. Procedural rationality, legal rationalism, the essence of modern bureaucracy and modern procedural organisation, right? We are at a conference about organisation. Procedural rationality or legal rationalism, the essence of modern bureaucracy and modern procedural organisation, is lethal to creation and innovation. The logic of creation is not procedural. It is not legal rational. It is not a methodical logic of process, policy or procedure. Let me, in a final observation, demonstrate this to you. Edward Beard Budding's lawnmower illustrates the logic, or rather analogic, of creation perfectly. Mr. Budding observed, this is in the 1820s, Mr. Budding observed a machine in a local cloth mill. The machine used a cutting cylinder, a blade reel, to trim the irregular textile nap off the surface of woolen cloth in order to give it a regular, even finish. Budding, metaphorically, that is to say, imaginatively translated from shaggy cloth fibre to overgrown grass. In doing so, his lawnmower replaced a labour-intensive scythe and saved generations of gardeners from back-breaking work. The analogical leap from textile fibre to lawn grass is typical of the path of creation, while procedural rationality, even of a smart kind, is the antithesis of that strange, imaginative leaping process. The more that our culture is dominated by procedural rationality, and the more that we load up our universities and other institutions of creation with bureaucratic modes of organisation and rampant administrative rationalities, the less creative we become. The less creative we are, the slower we grow the productivity, the prosperity and the just proportionality of the world. Upon that rests our future. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You walk through the British Museum and you look at the wonderful Greek sculptures of the classical Greek period, you know, the period of Aristotle and Plato a little bit later. And those statues of stone come alive. They're the most beautiful creations. And you think, you know, what's going on in the mind of the sculptor? This is brilliant. And then you walk into the Hellenistic sculpture periods, and they're sort of dead, basically. You just did a wonderful imitation of it. That's what happens. And my argument here is this is not just about institutions, but it's about the nature of the way we think or we don't think. And that the imagination is a certain kind of thinking, and that universities are now systematically committed to destroying that as swiftly as they can. In the mid-1980s onwards, there was a very aggressive, largely social democratic policy of pursuing the bureaucratisation of the universities, and it promised all sorts of things. One of the things it promised endlessly. You know how politicians promise and promise and promise and promise and promise and promise and promise the same thing constantly again. They have a propaganda barrage which is directed at you. What they promised was that this would produce more and better research. I am demonstrating to them, to that audience, that what they promised us was wrong. And they have done great damage in instituting a system which delivered the very opposite of what it promised to do.
I was thinking that the role of universities is often a bit over-exaggerated, because many of the innovative or the creativity that you mentioned did actually not come from universities. It came from other places, from creative people, I don't know, somewhere. And so maybe it's more about dynamic creative hubs of their time, where people come together, driven by some cultural and socio-economic drivers.
I agree.
And I think the role of universities, these hubs are often not in the university.
No. I guess what I would say here simply is that there's a general process going on of creativity decline, and that also includes the universities, but the university is not the only institution involved in that general process of decline.
But academic life is now segmented, segregated. You have to gain your academic identity within a narrow field, and it's very difficult to transcend these boundaries. The academics are themselves policing these boundaries. And so we are contributors, we are conspirators in this narrowing of the cognitive spaces available to us.
You have put it better than I could have put it.